My name is Paul Hook. I was born May 16th, 1929 in Rankin, Pennsylvania. I was raised during the Depression of the 1930s. I graduated from high school, Rankin High School, in 1947. I began working in the steel mills around Pittsburgh. In 1951, I enlisted in the United States Air Force and served until 1955 during the Korean War. In 1955, I was discharged, entered Duquesne University, graduated in 1959.
Was there anyone in your life or that you knew who was in the Vietnam War?
Yes. There were two people I knew. The first person I knew was when I lived in North Huntington. My neighbor, Joe Simke, was a major in the U.S. Army. And his job during the Vietnam War was to go to the families of soldiers who were killed in Vietnam and deliver the message that they had been killed. The other person I knew was my aunt's son, Paul Karenni. He was drafted and he served in Vietnam as an infantryman. When he came home from Vietnam, he went back to his job at, I think it was Duquesne Light. He was a draftsman. He only worked there a short time, and either he was fired or he quit, and he never worked again. And from there, he developed into an alcoholic. He currently lives in Whitaker in his mother and father's house. He walks the streets. He has a full beard, a full head of hair, an old army coat, and he walks the streets with a bag in his hand, and he's gone straight down the tubes as a result of his being in Vietnam. I don't know what kind of income he has. He probably has Social Security because he's in his 60s now.
What was your opinion of the hippie movement? Did you agree with their choice to go against social norms and oppose the war with peaceful protest?
Yes, I did. The hippie movement, I guess, actually started in San Francisco, out in California. Yeah, and they were peaceful. I mean, there was no rioting or anything like that. They just did their thing, you know. And they opposed the war in Vietnam, like a lot of people. And they opposed the racial intolerance, and they were helpful in bringing a lot of important issues to the forefront. A lot of people actually didn't approve of them because their lifestyle was so much different from the lifestyle that people were living at that time. You know, there weren't too many people that were running around in a VW bus and wearing the kind of clothes they wore and the long hair and the other things, but they really did a good thing.
Okay. The Vietnam War was the first televised war. How did that affect your perspective of the war and the perspective of those around you? Did you even watch any of it, and did it cause more people to worry?
The Vietnam War was on the evening news every night from the time it started, from the time that the U.S. was involved, on the news every night, showing actual battle scenes and wounded and whatever. Yes, it affected a lot of people. That's why they were against the war. You know, there were 58,000 American soldiers were killed in Vietnam. And it affected everybody. Just to see that every night, and the news people, you know how they are, they made sure that it was on every 6 o'clock news, 7 o'clock news, scenes from Vietnam. So it really affected a lot of people. That's why there were so many people against the war in Vietnam.
How would you compare the Korean War, which you served in, to the Vietnam War? How did they seem different or alike?
Well, the Korean War started when North Korea, which was a communist country, decided they were going to invade South Korea and make the Korean Peninsula one country. They crossed the border, and at that time, Truman, who was president, was it Truman? Yes. Ordered the troops, U.S. troops, into Korea to stop the North Koreans. The difference was that the Korean War was really a war that was backed by the United Nations. The United States wasn't the only country with troops in that war. There were troops from England, from Australia, from Greece, from Turkey. So it was not really an American war, but the majority of the troops there were American. Now the difference between that war, first of all, the Korean War was only started five years after the end of World War II. So there are a lot of personnel who were fighting in Korea also fought in World War II. The Vietnam War was a war where the Vietnam government was being challenged by the Viet Cong, which was a communist organization. The United States started involvement in that war, I think it was prior to Kennedy's election, by sending advisors, just advisors over to advise the Vietnam government. In 1965, President Johnson decided that, well, we're going to go all out with this war. And it ended up with 265,000 American troops in Vietnam. There was no other country aiding in that war. It was primarily the U.S. government against the North Viet Cong troops. Like I said before, there were 58,000 American troops killed in that war. The reason people were against the war, first of all, everybody felt, what are we doing over there? I mean, that's none of our business. If they want to fight among themselves to see who's going to represent the government, that's their problem. The other thing is, the Vietnam War, they instigated the draft, okay? And people were against that. One of the reasons was that we were sending young boys, 18, 19, 20 years old, drafted over there to fight. One of the things about the draft was, if you were in college, if you were a college student, you were exempt. You weren't drafted until you finished your schooling. A lot of people sent their sons to Canada to get away from the draft. And a lot of young boys went to Canada to live to get away from the draft. So, that war was not very popular. And if you want to talk to anybody who was in that war, ask them how they felt when they came home. There were no parades saying, oh, you did a good job, blah, 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 nothing like that.
Do you think the Kennedy presidency was overall successful or unsuccessful?
Well, some people thought he was successful, some people thought he wasn't, but he didn't really live long enough to determine whether he was a successful president. Some of the things he did was very successful. He pushed for the space program. He pushed to have a man on the moon. He was unsuccessful in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. He didn't support that very well. That failed. The Bay of Pigs invasion was conducted by Cuban expatriates who were living in Florida and decided that they would invade Cuba and do away with Castro. But Kennedy refused to give them air support, so they didn't. It wasn't successful. The Cubans stopped them and captured them, and that wasn't very successful. He was successful in the Cuban missile crisis when U.S. planes photographed Russian missile sites being built in Cuba. He set up a blockade of Cuba and refused to let any ships enter their harbors. He finally got Nikita Khrushchev to back down, and they removed all the missiles from Cuba, and the missile sites were dismantled, so he was successful there. He was also successful as a person because he was very charismatic, good-looking. Everybody thought he was great. But as far as his being an overall success, there were a lot of people who didn't think so.
Buddy, go ahead.
What was your initial reaction to the assassination of JFK on November 2nd, 1963?
Like everybody else, it was a shock. Everybody just couldn't believe it, that an American president could be assassinated in this country. People were just in complete shock. How did that happen? Everybody thought, we were safe from everything. This was the United States. Nothing like that happens here, but it did, and people were in complete shock with that.
Were you watching it on television when it happened?
No, I was not watching it on television. I was at work. It happened in the afternoon. What time? 3 o'clock or something like that?
Yeah.
Down in Dallas, Texas. No, most people were at work when it happened. Not too many were watching it on TV, although they did have it on TV. They were showing he was in Texas, and they were showing him in the motorcade and everything. So if you were watching on TV, you probably saw some of it. But most people, I would venture to say, didn't see it on TV.
How did you feel about the Vietnam War? Did you support it or were you against it?
I was against it. As I said before, I couldn't see any reason to send our boys over there to fight a war. Those people should have been able to settle their own problems. And the result was, after all the money and all the casualties and everything that happened over there, we didn't win. We didn't win. It was decided that, okay, there'd be a ceasefire and we would bring all our troops home. And in essence, the Viet Cong won. They won that war. They won out. They would have won anyway. And why were we over there? For what reason? What was the benefit to us? I couldn't understand that, and I still don't understand that.
Okay, Paul.
Was it difficult to raise children during this time period?
Not really. I mean, we lived in North Huntington, and our life didn't change that much because of that Vietnam War, because we didn't have anybody that really, was in that war that affected us in any way. And no, it wasn't difficult. We got along pretty good during that time period.
Were you afraid that they would not be raised with the same wholesome family values that you were raised with?
No. No, because we did raise them that way. Okay? We raised them to be respectful. We raised them to be good students. We raised them to go to college and get an education. That was always one of the things we always stressed, that you're going to go to college. Once you finish high school, you're going to college. We kept saying that and saying that. So that when it happened, when he graduated from high school, it was like, okay, where are we going to go to school? We always encouraged him to get a higher education. So that was good for us and them.
Okay, Pat. How did Martin Luther King Jr. influence civil rights?
He brought it to the forefront prior to his bringing the problems of the South. People really didn't know what was happening in the South. People in the North didn't realize black people had to drink out of a separate water fountain. They couldn't eat in a white restaurant. They had to ride in the back of the bus. They went to segregated schools. And most people, when he brought that to the forefront, most people says, what do you mean they went to segregated schools? Because up north here, the schools were all weren't segregated. Blacks and whites, especially where I went to school, we were all in one class, but not down in the South. And he influenced the civil rights movement. One of the things that it resulted was, number one, the Civil Rights Voting Act. Down south, prior to that, the blacks, there weren't too many that voted, because every voting district had certain rules that they required black voters to answer, and most of the rules, I would venture to say even the white voters could have answered. What was the Fifth Amendment? What was this? What was that? And if you couldn't answer it correctly, then sorry, pal, you can't vote. So they gave the voting right to the blacks. But even today, some of the southern states, they make it hard on blacks to vote, even though the right to the Right to Vote Act was passed. And the other thing is that the desegregation of the schools in the South. That was another big thing that resulted from the civil rights movement, where the southern states couldn't have separate schools for blacks and whites. And that took a lot of, they had to send troops down there, the National Guard, to get the kids to go into the white schools. But yeah, he did a lot of good things. He brought forth the problems of the South that most of the country, never even heard of. And most of the people say, what do you mean they couldn't go into a white restaurant? What do you mean they had to drink out of a separate water fountain? They had water fountains that says blacks only. Now can you imagine that here? So yeah, he brought that all out. So he did a good thing.
What were some of the best and worst times of the 1960s?
The best and worst times of the 1960s? Okay, the best times was the fact that the middle class in this country prospered. That was a result of all the veterans from World War II who got a college education as a result of the GI Bill, graduated and were getting jobs, and the economy was doing very well. As a result of the space program, there are a lot of innovations that were developed through the space program. The worst times of the 1960s obviously was the Vietnam War, and the country was relatively safe, except for when when Kennedy was assassinated at the beginning of the war. That really shook a lot of people up. But in the long run, the 60s were pretty good. Like I said, the only really bad thing about it was, in my opinion, was the Vietnam War. So it was a good era from the 60s to the 70s.
Okay, well, thank you for coming and letting us interview you.
Thank
It's really nice. You had great answers, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Do I get paid or something?